Question number 3, Andrew Little.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister of Finance. Does he stand by his statement that, quotes, "The prices you pay for a house are ridiculous," end quote, given New Zealand house prices have risen by over 50% since he made that statement?
The Honourable Bill English.
Mr. Speaker, yes. And the main change that's occurred since that statement was made is the Auckland Unitary Plan, which because of this government's legislation was passed in 3 years instead of 10, it now legally allows sufficient new supply of housing, and over the next 10 years, along with a major government building program, will have an influence on house prices.
Supplementary.
Supplementary question, Andrew Little.
Is there a housing crisis, yes or no?
The Honourable Bill English.
Mr. Speaker, no. New Zealand is building tens of thousands of houses over the next few years because of the changes the government has made to and will make to the regulation of housing markets and planning and the government's own building program. We will see considerable growth, further growth in the supply of houses and a moderation of the housing cycle.
Supplementary.
Supplementary question, Andrew Little.
Does he stand by his statement that, quotes, "The most unfair aspect of it is that there's no housing being built for people in the lowest quartile of income, like none. That is clearly unsustainable."
The Honourable Bill English.
Mr. Speaker, yes, and at the time that was absolutely correct, because the old Auckland plan and city plans, which used to be all supported by the Labor Party, had the result that no lower cost housing was being built in areas like the North Shore. That is now changing, for instance, through the 1,000 house development that has been begun by Housing New Zealand in Northcote, where 1,000 medium-density, medium-value houses will be produced.
Order. Supplementary question, Jamie Lee Ross.
What steps is the government taking as part of it?
Order. Can I just detect an air of anticipation and excitement, but I still need to get through question time with me being able to hear the questions being asked. Jamie Lee Ross.
Supplementary question. What steps is the government taking as part of its comprehensive plan to deliver more houses and more affordable housing?
The Honourable Bill English.
Mr. Speaker, because housing, the phenomenon of housing is so complex, it takes a large number of initiatives to push the housing market in the right direction, ranging from the $1 billion Housing Infrastructure Fund, the special housing areas, expanded Home Start scheme for first-home buyers, the National Policy Statement on Urban Development, the macro-prudential tools for the Reserve Bank, the fast-tracking of the Auckland Unitary Plan, and the large-scale building program that the government is setting out on.
Supplementary question, Andrew Little.
Does he accept it was a mistake for him to rip over $500 million in profits out of housing in New Zealand while kids were getting sick and dying in cold, mouldy state houses?
That's right. The Honourable Bill English.
Mr. Speaker, no. And the action the government has taken intensive and expensive action to reduce exactly the situation the member describes. The project for the reduction of rheumatoid arthritis has been all about finding the kids who come from those houses, either changing the houses or shifting them to a warm, dry house. The government committed 60 or 80 million to that, and the program has been quite successful but has some way to go.
Order. Supplementary question, the Right Honourable Winston Peters.
Minister, if it can be proven, as it can be, that none of his commitments and promises on housing have been kept, will he promise not to stand for the leadership come Monday?
The Honourable Bill English.
Mr. Speaker, as I've laid out, while the member may not have paid much attention, there's been a raft of measures taken on changing the housing market. We're dealing with the legacy of 30 years of wrong-headed planning, which was designed to stop Auckland growing. Under this government, the economy is growing, Auckland is growing, and we need to change all the housing rules to accommodate all the people who want to live here.
Supplementary question, Andrew Little.
Does his management of the housing crisis have the confidence of his fellow Minister Judith Collins, or doesn't he want her support given he thinks she has, quotes, an unfortunately high estimation of her own competence?
The Honourable Bill English.
Mr. Speaker, yes.
Supplementary question, Right Honourable Winston Peters.
If we've had, as the Minister says, 30 years of planning failure, which government was it that brought in the present legislation on the Resource Management Act? No?
The Honourable Bill English.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the member would know that question, the answer to that question, because he was here right from the genesis of the RMA under Sir Geoffrey Palmer, I think, and has almost certainly voted for more RMA amendments than anyone else in the House.
Order. 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 Just need a little less interjection from both sides. Andrew Little, supplementary question.
Mr. Speaker, does he have confidence in Paula Bennett as a minister, given she misled the Prime Minister about non-existent MSD flying squads and launched a policy to move people out of Auckland without asking the Minister of Finance?
Order. Order. There's no ministerial responsibility for that as the Minister for Finance.
Supplementary.
Supplementary question, Andrew Little.
Does he stand by his statement that, quotes, I wouldn't want to go for the leadership of the National Party again?
Questionable whether that's ministerial responsibility. I'll allow the Minister, the Honourable Bill English.
What's that?
I'll say it's questionable whether there is ministerial responsibility, but I'll allow the Minister to... Order.
Mr. Speaker, yes, of course, but I have now find myself in the rather unexpected position where the most successful Prime Minister in my lifetime has decided to leave at the top.
Question.